Hello, hello, hello.
Hello.
How are you, Ciaran?
I'm good, thanks, mate. Raring to go.
So today, you very kindly offered to join me, and we are going to take a crack at modernizing PHP development using Docker, Docker-compose, and Kubernetes.
Yeah, I'm excited because I've seen a few different ways of doing it, and I want to hear your way.
Well, so I mean, the confession here is the last time I wrote a line of PHP was probably in 2016. However,
still the same.
I'm good on the Docker stuff, right? So,
yeah.
like, between us, we got this, I'm sure. So, do you just want to do a quick introduction? You happy to do that for 30 seconds?
Hello, everyone. I'm Ciaran. I'm primarily a software developer, so I'm less of an ops person. I do a lot of consulting, a lot of TDD and BDD stuff, a lot of agile stuff, and I've kind of avoided caring too much about where stuff gets deployed until the last few years. And I think I've got a decent Docker knowledge. I'm terrible at orchestration, so you may lose me towards the end, but I'm sort of up on containers, and someone else takes care of that other stuff a lot of the time. I guess that's it, right? One of the things about Docker is that even if you're just a software person, right, you're having to understand how those things work because it's maybe how you're running it locally as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I think that what we're going to look at today is how do we use these tools to make the local development process better, but then get at that the last mile as well into something like Kubernetes or any container-based deployment tool, really. But we'll focus on Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And I'm not too worried about my lack of PHP knowledge because when it comes to container-based development, there's only two ways to go. There's dynamic and interpreted languages, and then there's compiled languages. Like, that's it. Like, there's only two workflows, and I've never seen a runtime or a language or a framework where that changes beyond those two dynamics. So yeah, I'm pretty confident.
I think in a typical PHP project, you also have to understand it's likely to also be a JavaScript project. So something that people find difficult is that they're having to manage those two separate build pipelines and how they interact.
I never even gave that a moment's thought. So as that comes up, we'll tackle it one step at a time.
Yeah, that's just from my experience of, here's a nice PHP deployment pipeline, and someone says, well, how do I get my Webpack stuff into that as well? Because I've got to transpile all this TypeScript I've written. And you kind of shrug your shoulders if you're a PHP person.
Yeah, we'll do our best to tackle that too.
Because that's more like a compile pipeline style, right?
Well, yeah, it has a build step that generates some assets that need to be consumed from the actual web server side of things. I think actually it would be really cool to cover that, because one of the things we're going to focus on today is a split between the PHP code being interpreted by php-fpm and nginx actually running as the web server. So being able to deliver those static assets into the nginx server, and then just have the PHP code being delivered from PHP. Depending on how this works, again, I haven't written PHP in a long time, but we could easily go the other way and have php-fpm deliver those static assets too. So this is where your wonderful judgment is going to have to keep me right on what is best practice in PHP land.
And so the question that comes up lots and lots in PHP land when you're doing Docker is, because PHP isn't a web server, FPM isn't a web server, typically people are using nginx and FPM. And so the obvious question that every Slack and every IRC channel has is, should I put them in the one container or should I have two containers? And I know you've got an opinion. That's
I do definitely have an opinion. So I'm going to share my screen right away because I have tackled this question before. I gave a talk in 2018. In fact, I've given this talk many, many times. I'm sure I think you've seen it on more than one occasion, but it's my Kickass Development Environments with Docker talk. I gave this talk from 2016 to 2018. the one that's got the most traction and questions is this one from Laracon, to being at such a large event. But in this talk, what I said to people was, always deploy them separately. Always deploy nginx and FPM separately. And it's important to note that while Kubernetes was definitely probably still the default container orchestration tool in production in 2018, this talk focused purely on local development, nothing else. And what I suggested people do is to use a Docker option, which allows you to consume the volumes from one container in another container, which meant that you could have nginx consume all of the code volume from the FPM container, and you didn't have to worry about the files not existing on the nginx container, because that's the biggest problem, right? People say, "Oh, I need things in nginx because nginx has to know the file exists."
Does it need to know about the PHP files?
It doesn't. No. So
it's the other thing I'm talking about, right? It's the
so that's what I want to show today. Exactly. The nginx actually doesn't care if those files exist or not. It can forward them without doing any local checks. So while the volumes from option in the talk is still very much valid and you can use that for local development, it falls flat when you go to production. Very difficult to have a volume of your code being orchestrated on multiple nodes and consumed from two containers. So we're just going to promote the idea that nginx doesn't care and doesn't need to care about that. And one of the questions I get all the time, or just at the bottom of the thread, are, do you have an example of how I do this today? People want to see this. They want the code, right? They don't want to have to write this themselves. And that's our plan. And we're going to provide the code for people to do this without having to constantly leave questions and comments on this video. With that in mind, I have gone ahead and created a PHP examples repository on GitLab/Rawkode/PHP-examples. I will synchronize it to GitHub later, but for now, this is where it's going to live. And I have it checked out locally, and assuming our setup is working nicely, you should have the ability to typey somewhere in this file.
It's loading. It's loading.
Okay, well, it's not important.
It might be saturating my bandwidth.
But you can always see what I'm typing. We can try and program it that way, and if we really need to, we'll refresh your set. Okay.
Yeah, it does work. Okay, let me try typing something.
Oh, there we go. You're now in my file. Hello. Perfect. So I've only added some readmes right now so that I can push this repository. So the plan being that we'll cover using Docker-Compose for local development, cover the last mile of getting into Kubernetes, tackle any pain points and pitfalls as we go. You're going to keep me right on everything that you have inside of your head, and I will do my best to describe everything that I'm doing as we go. Now, my plan, delete that because that will annoy me, was to use Slim Framework. I'm now doubting that decision already because I don't think that Slim has that Node.js dependency build step, and maybe it's better to do something that's a bit more feature complete, or at least has all those steps for us to deal with. What are your thoughts?
I don't have a strong preference which framework. I'm not an expert in how to build web assets, so I'm regretting making it, kind of. But we could do something in Slim and just add a little transpile step to something. Or we could just talk about it.
No, okay. We'll continue with the plan. We'll just it's definitely the easiest way to get a PHP web framework going that I'm familiar with. We can very easily add like a package.json, pull in some random node dependency and have it spit out an asset. Right? I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Which means that what we have to do is create a new Slim framework application. So how do I do that?
Do you just install it with Composer and then make an index PHP? Something along those lines?
Yep. So according to their documentation, we do composer space create -project We then have Slim, Sun Skeleton, Dev, Master, and the final parameter is an app main.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to put it in a local directory. Hopefully it still does that, but we'll call this Docker and Kubernetes.
Yeah, that should be fine.
It's now saying it's not empty, but that's okay. Force. I don't see a. I'm just going to type force.
I think it won't install into an existing folder.
Oh, it won't. Well,
You can just make another folder and copy the README. Yeah.
oh, I just. I'm sure I just put my README over the other README. Anyway, not bad. So let's try that again. Create our project.
Has it got?
Oh, I'm not in the right directory. That's why. So let's go inside Docker and Kubernetes. Let's move README without destroying it. So r.md and do a composer. Create project. Docker, and we'll get there. It's better to have these challenges and little slip ups at the start, because then it means nothing goes wrong later.
Are you on Composer 2?
I have no idea. Composer didn't even exist on this machine until about 10 minutes ago. So.
It's a little bit faster. Maybe if we use Composer in the build step, we can use 2 in the Docker. But
I just did a brew install Composer. I'm assuming if Composer 2 is released and not in an RC stage or anything like that, then I would probably.
It's a beta stage, but you know, it's not runtime code, so it's okay to use a beta.
Always. I say that as I'm running on macOS Big Sur beta.
So what do you think? Big Sur has some sort of fancy new virtualization framework built into the OS. Do you think that's going to make Docker run fast?
So it does have APIs for tools like Docker for Mac and other stuff to create VMs, Vagrant. It's not something that I've tried yet, because I don't think anything that I've installed works with it at the moment. I'm really hoping though that whatever they've configured to do the file synchronization has to be an improvement on what we have right now. Like for dynamic interpreted languages, the file sync on Docker for Mac is the killer. Yeah, it's just makes developing any sizable project very, very slow.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's this prompt? Do I want to remove the existing get history? No.
I've not seen that before. It's interesting.
I guess it's just because I have stuff going on here. Not really sure. So let's see, what have I got here? Oh, well, it did create me a new directory. Let's just move on that. Okay, perfect. So we have a composer JSON file.
With a bunch of stuff.
Look at that. It gives us a Docker compose file.
That's a bit too fancy, isn't it? So it's using Alpine.
It is. So it's a working directory, mixing command and entry point together. It's even using the Rawkode approved environments in the syntax. I really hate it when people use the list syntax. Do that. Like, why would we do this to ourselves? That's a run for another day. We expose a port and we have volumes. I mean, it looks pretty sensible to me. I'm not going to be making too many changes. There are a few things in the 3.x spec, on the compose spec, that I don't like. We may drop that down to 2 for very good reasons. We'll touch on them if we make enough progress.
So let's just explain one thing to me. What Is that a good practice to be running PHP as the entry point?
So this is
That's not a good web server.
for local dev. I think it's fine. I don't really have any problems with it. It does mean that our development environment doesn't have any sort of parity with our production environment. So, you know, there may be things to do with, like, you know, this has an HT access in this public folder. Like, that's not going to do anything on an nginx environment, for example. So you may find that if you're using that HT access for any sort of security concerns or redirects, anything like that, that discrepancy between production and development, it would just frustrate me. I probably would avoid it. But I can see why they're doing it. They're just trying to avoid any additional complexity in this environment.
I'm actually surprised how much stuff there is, considering Slim is. I haven't made a Slim project in a while. Slim is a cut-down framework. They've got Travis set up and all sorts.
Yeah, ADR, directory style structures. Not the Slim framework I remember from 2015, that's for sure. All right, let's just test this works locally, then get it working in Docker. Does that sound sensible to you? Yeah.
Would you be more specific about the version of PHP?
Okay, so you're talking about using 7-Alpine instead of 7.1-Alpine?
Or 7.4, maybe.
Or 7, yeah, sorry. I'm trying my best here,
but yeah, exactly.
Would I specify a point version? I think very possibly. I mean, I don't pay a lot of attention to the PHP RFCs anymore, but I do believe they make a lot of changes.
Is VS Code saying that you wrote that line? You know, you were surprised.
Did I add this?
4 years ago.
I did.
So all these criticisms are criticisms of you.
No, see, I don't think I added this. Hold on. Hold on.
Slamming this Docker Compose file, and it's your work.
I wasn't slamming it. Let's see. There must be a scan. Well, we've got a couple of comments, so let's just see what's going on. We've got one here that says, if we go with Laravel, then Laravel mix ships with some JavaScript stuff. So definitely, I will provide a Laravel example either in this session or just after this session. We'll see how things go. We got Glenn asking how late you are. You're not late. We're just started. We've not done anything of use for anyone. And we have our friend Bastian who is tuning in. Nice to see you too. So, skeleton.
If you're a Slim contributor.
Yeah, that's me. Well, how much am I? Yeah, so someone modified this version. I'll have worked with that person. It's not fair. This is just. Let me cover the version in more detail before we get started then. So when Docker promoted the Compose spec to 3.x, they really targeted people that wanted to then go from local development to production. So they added all of these extra parameters or pragmas, whatever you want to call them, that allowed you to then use the same Docker Compose file to generate a Docker bundle, which could be deployed on Docker Swarm.
Yeah.
They eventually added Kubernetes stuff on top of that. I can't remember the exact version, 3.4 or 3.5, whatever it was, which means you can now just deploy that Docker bundle or the Compose file straight to Kubernetes. The challenge is that while we want parity between Docker, between development and production, is that there are some very key changes in the way that you work from a workflow perspective that just don't translate. Like on a Kubernetes environment, I don't care about the order containers start in because they're going to be deployed in their own way with their own CI and CD pipeline. For local development, I very much care about the order and the way that things are started because I might have database migrations to run. I need the database server to be healthy. I've got Webpack steps that are really important. There's all of these things that need to be coordinated. Yeah. 2.x specs makes that really easy to do through very sophisticated health checks. So we probably will drop that version down, and that's why. And we can maybe show why it's painful first, and then jump back and say, this is why you should just use 2.0.
So I've heard the argument that the health checks should be part of your application, part of your system, and not the responsibility of the orchestration tool. If I'm writing a worker that's going to read from a queue, I've got two options, haven't I? Either I can write my code assuming the queue's there and kind of outsource that readiness, or I can write my application so it's going to have some sort of retry as part of my code of my worker. Where do you fall on that?
So I do agree that your application has to be built with that resiliency factor in mind, and that if things do go wrong, it will retry it. Yeah. Of course, that makes sense to me. But again, spinning up something in local development, it's just that bootstrapping phase is so unique and so different that I just think it's really important. Like when I start my applications, I really want to build code that retries my migration path until it works.
Yeah.
I mean, no. When I go to production, I want that if that migration step fails, I want an error log, and I want something to say, hey, this is not working. I don't want us to just silently keep retrying without giving me any indicators that something's potentially wrong.
Yeah.
So,
and I guess on production, you're not doing a cold start very often of all your services together.
Yeah, only once when you spin up a new cluster of some kind.
So, and on dev, if one of your services falls over, you probably stop everything and start it all again.
I am a serial destroyer and recreator of the world. I like to do that frequently. I like to do it often, and I like to make sure that our mission works. So,
yeah,
definitely.
So there's that tricky. So this leads us to using Docker-compose local and Kubernetes, but there's a kind of what are the downsides of that? It means you don't quite know it's going to work until you deploy to some Kubernetes environment. You have more stuff control. It's less. You're not dog fooding it as much.
You get a very limited amount of the features of Kubernetes available to you when you go through the compose file, using that as the description of your Kubernetes deployment. To the point where I'd say you're really just using the wrong tool for the job. And you should just be using a Kubernetes manifest and getting familiar with working with that, because even if your application is a monolithic PHP application, there's still surrounding services that you need to deploy. And I don't think the compose file is a good way to describe that for all environments. Especially, again, the database I'm going to keep hammering on about. But my production deployment of a database does not look like my development deployment of a database. And yeah, there are Docker Compose overlays and the ability to extend service definitions per environment. But then we're just getting into this really convoluted setup that I don't think is actually going to save you any time in the long run. It's probably just going to slow you down and cause a little bit of chaos.
Yeah, and looking forward, I think the idea, a lot of the supporting infrastructure like databases and queues and things, the trend seems to be away from running them yourself. I don't know if that's your experience. So
no, you're completely right.
My Docker Compose locally is going to be running a MySQL instance or whatever. But in prod, maybe I'm using Aurora serverless or some other. I know MySQL is not the best database, but you know what I
mean. Exactly. When we're deploying things into Azure, AWS, or even GCP, all those managed services become really, really appealing, and that we don't have to handle the complicated stateful side of our applications anymore.
So maybe we're only deploying the FPM service.
Extremely likely. Exactly. All right, let's get started then. So, yes, it turns out I contributed this compose file. I had no idea, but that's not important. Good catch. I never noticed that.
So that looks like
that line's not even changed in 4 years. That's still just PHP 7 Alpine.
So, can you recap what the Docker true environment variables for?
No. I'm not sure what this is for. So it's been 4 years, Ciaran. I'm assuming there's something in the configuration of this application. Found it right away. There we go. So Perfect. I'm assuming I didn't add that too.
So if it's in the Docker environment, it logs
It logs to standard out. Yeah.
So why does the compose file have a logs volume?
I'm not sure.
That might not be being used then in Docker.
Very possibly. It could be that. Yeah, I don't know. Let's find out. Let's get it working. Let's get it working. So I'm surprised I've contributed to this repository because there's no make file.
The big argument against that is Windows doesn't ship with make. That's why Symfony ended up not using make after very nearly adopting it as the recommended way of doing things.
But sure, I mean, times are changing. I don't want to get into the whole WSL2 and Windows being a really cool dev machine now, but make is available. It's not on your command line. Anyway. So how do I run this? I do PHP, bin, no bin, that's a Symfony thing, right?
You do Docker-compose.
Wow, I just want to run it locally first.
PHP-S.
I'm assuming Composer has tasks, right?
Yeah, they're called scripts.
Scripts. So I can just do Composer start. That work?
Yep.
All right, and if I go to here, 8080, right, and it works.
Good site. Where did it log to? Did you see any logs?
I was about to check. No.
Were there some in the terminal? Yeah.
There were. Yeah.
But that's the web server's logs. That's not the.
Oh yeah. Well, no, because it's the same thing, right? Oh no, the application will be different because it's got its own logger. Okay.
Maybe it's not logging.
So, assuming I haven't made this the worst Docker compose file in the world 4 years ago, it should.
That takes a while.
It just eats so much battery that you've got to close it when you're not using it, right?
Yeah, I kind of want a script that wraps Docker and starts it. If it's not started, if you see what I mean.
I think that would be good.
Starting on it.
I mean, I'm not going to do it right now, but I don't think it would be.
How much stuff is in the vendor folder while that's pulling? It's quite a lot of stuff, isn't there? Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's a lot. I mean, I've been working on some Node projects lately, so this looks quite slim. Pun intended.
That's all going to be mapped, isn't it?
Yeah, so we could do a file count here and see how many files we're actually dealing with. I found that anything above usually 4,000 and things start to creak. So, let's see. So this is running, so we should be able to refresh. We're still good.
What was the page load time, just out of interest? Can you?
Or does it tell me that here? Go to network, and we're at 350 milliseconds for hello world. That's pretty slow. I want that faster.
It is slow, but it's okay. If you're a developer looking at a site in a browser, it's usable, isn't it?
Okay, so what we want to do first and foremost is remove the PHP web server, and we want to bring in FPM and nginx.
Yeah, that's two separate containers, right?
It's two separate containers. That is the question that we're getting asked for the example of. So that will be the first thing we tackle. So it's formatted. Oh, there's no editorconfig in this. Slim is letting me down. So I am a tab person, just for the record, but I've got so fed up of fighting it. It was just, the world has gone spacey crazy.
Shouldn't you be setting the indent size just for YAML? Because everything else is for.
YAML, I think that's the right thing. Okay. We just call this podcast "How to Get Distracted by Every Trivial Detail without actually doing any real work."
Sorry, I know that's me.
I thought that would work. It didn't. Let's just do. Yeah, no, there's no Kubernetes yet. I'll do it later. There we go. We're adding nginx, which has an image.
Why do we need nginx? It's because FPM itself isn't going to be able to respond to web requests because it doesn't have an HTTP interface.
Yeah, so to the best of my knowledge, FPM is just processes the PHP and it takes requests in over a socket and spits something back out over a socket, but doesn't actually deliver any web server functionality, right?
Yeah, it's using the fast CGI connection is how I understand it. So it doesn't have an HTTP web server built in. And that's maybe a historical thing, right? Because normally you'd have nginx and FPM on one box. Or you'd have a mod Apache in the old days. So it didn't feel wrong having these two daemons running that are going to just to do one thing. Maybe that's why the question comes up a lot. When you go into Docker world, you've got this ideology that you should just have one process per container. But then you need two containers to do one thing, which feels wrongish.
Yeah, so in a Docker environment, you do need, you should always have one process per container, and you do need two containers to run a PHP application. That, when it moves to Kubernetes, though, it starts to leverage something called the pod, which understands that there should be multiple containers there. Right. So it's a much better fit in the Kubernetes kind of landscape. But yeah, for Docker Compose, it can feel a little bit counterintuitive. But again, talking about parity between development and production, we really do want to isolate these things. And they both have very different purposes. nginx, we just want to deliver static assets. FPM, we just want to run it. And the challenge of running both of those in the one container is, how do you write a health check for a container with multiple processes? If FPM dies and nginx is still healthy, is that container good? If nginx dies and FPM is still running, is that container good? And you don't want to start writing health checks that are checking for multiple sockets being open and checking that they're both valid, and it's too much work.
I guess health checks are a kind of second line of defense, aren't they? The first health check for a container is it still running? And if you can make it so that as long as the main process is running, the container's fine, you don't have to worry as much about health checks.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Because I know I've seen people running supervisor D as their entry point, or running lots of workers, or system D.
If you're running a supervisor in your container, that is see, this is where there's this little tiny bit of nuance. It's like there is a very good use case for running a supervisor, usually tiny inside a Docker container. But we're going to ignore that for now. If you're running a supervisor in a container, there's too much going on. Just use a VM, use Vagrant. Yeah, just go down that approach and fine. But,
yeah, if you're running an entry point that you know is something designed never to die, it doesn't tell you about the health of the system.
Yeah. All right, sidetracked again. Let's do this. Valuable information. I think these are good things. So so what have I done? I've added nginx. I'm using an nginx image. I'm not going to bother about a tag right now. I'm not that fussed about the version of it. I'm exposing this on port 8080 now, which means I need to remove 8080 from FPM, even though it's not FPM yet. And that's fine. We don't actually need FPM to be exposed. We can remove an entire attack vector here by not having FPM exposed to our customers or users. So we remove that away. And I'm happy for that just to run right now. It makes no difference to me. I'm just going to spin this back up. And what we should see is we now have nginx, PHP still running, but not serving any traffic to it.
Yeah. I can't remember what the default nginx response is. Is it page not found or something? Probably.
Yeah, I think you get no. So the nginx container will deliver a hi, this is nginx.
Oh, will it?
Yeah. That should be relatively smallish. Yep. So we do have Slim still running, and we have nginx. I refresh this page. 3 milliseconds. See, good numbers. All right. Now we still want to deliver our PHP application. So what I'm going to do is we're going to move this over to FPM.
Is there an FPM Alpine tag, maybe? I think there is. Or Alpine FPM.
Let's jump over to hub.docker.com/_/php. FPM Alpine. Yeah, there does seem to be an Alpine variant. Now, how does that run? So let's just grab this Dockerfile. Unless you know and you just want to tell me. But
it has its own entry point that if you specify a command that's a PHP command, it will run it. Otherwise, it will start FPM. That's my understanding.
So this points off to initial cost. Right, so assuming we're doing 4 Alpine FPM.
Yeah, it runs that in.
Well, it's not actually using the entry point, unless that's configured early. Oh, there we go. Okay. So FPM port 9000, and what path is this expecting?
I think it's var www.
Does it have a worker? Yeah, var www.html. Okay, so we're just going to change this to match. We don't need a command override anymore. We're happy with whatever's going on the default. As far as volumes go, we want our code in the right location. And that has to be updated to that. Look okay?
Looks good to me.
Okay. So I'm going to assume that's going to work, because if I restart this, there's nothing for me to verify that this works. What we need to do now is tell nginx how to proxy the request to FPM. Now for this, we're going to need a configuration file. So I'm going to create an opt directory. Nginx inside of that, and my vhost.conf. Did you bring the nginx configuration with you?
I've copy pasted it from project to project, and then
I
got someone to look at it for me, and it kind of annoys me that I need to do that. So I think there's a gap in the market for an image that is just the nginx container with a sensible PHP config.
So after the Laravel talk, I did push this up.
Oh.
So we're just going to grab this. This is what it looks like. So we have the server definition that runs on port 80. This is using app. Let's just match those paths up. Avoid any complications.
Yeah.
Our application is delivered from a public.
Yeah.
And this is the old way. So this is the one where you would need to share the volume. So I'm going to leave that in so that we can actually see that fail.
Yeah.
And then,
yeah.
Sorry, on you go.
It comes from the model where your nginx is also going to serve all your static assets, right? In the we have to sort of see if the file exists, otherwise we'll run PHP.
Yes, so what this is doing is saying if this URL doesn't exist, then pass it as a parameter, I believe, through the PHP, so that we have this kind of single entry point, and then the PHP application handles the routing there. And we can change the configuration of this so that it does the try files, but not for PHP files, and then for PHP files, regardless of exists or not, just send it to FPM and let it deal with it.
Okay. But I think I don't even think that's that sensible, really. Like, I don't know if in production people do scale their PHP nginx. Does the PHP nginx have to be the same as the static assets nginx? Maybe you'd want them to scale separately. or possibly when you get to some point, you're going to use a CDN for all your static stuff, and this is only ever going to serve PHP.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a few caveats there. I probably wouldn't go down the route of having my static assets delivered from something that wasn't delivering the PHP traffic, because from a customer perspective, they're hitting the same endpoint, whether it's a static asset or a PHP file, and I'd want that to be a one single entry point and not do any complicated routing there. Also, just because I'm reading this, this actually is set up to work. So this location, but then we have this PHP filter which passes it to FPM. So this actually should work. This config is actually good. So it's expecting something to exist on a DNS name of PHP on port 9000. So if we just change this from Slim to PHP, that should immediately work without me doing any other changes. The only other... Sorry, on you go.
In the right place.
Can you say that again, please?
You need to map the config file.
You are very correct. We need a volumes, and we need to take opt nginx vhost.conf, and we need to put this in. That might be right. Let's double check that. So
I think anything in confd is okay.
Yeah, but there is a default virtual host, and I want to replace it to avoid a configuration error. So if I do docker container ls, I'll make that bigger. And exec instead, I keep falling back in the bad practice. From bash, let's take a look at conf.c. So we should be able to override that. I think, not that I want to get too confident, but that is enough. So we're going to stop everything. And patiently. I'm just going to back it. Okay. So if I pop back over here, we have our PHP application. It's getting longer now, 558 milliseconds. But it is being delivered via nginx. Now we can confirm that by doing fake. That looks like a Slim error. Okay. Ah, no, okay, so that file doesn't exist. Okay, so if we look at our virtual configuration, if the file does not exist, it goes through index.php. Okay.
So can we take that whole bit out?
That would mean that we would, so we could definitely. It just means that our entry point for this application would have to be that. What we can do is modify the nginx. We can drop something into that nginx container, right? So just to show that it works, we don't need to do anything else. So that is B6, right? Of course, there's a duplicate B6, E9. We can go to www.html. That totally wasn't the path for the...
No, that's correct. We didn't mount any of the files into nginx.
Okay. Just make it work for now. So we can do touch here in .html. Echo fail.
Yeah.
And in theory, we can now skip. This could be a static asset essentially, and we can say here in. Okay.
2 milliseconds.
Much faster. This is why you don't want FPM delivering a static asset. Okay, where is my code? So we're happy with that. We're happy with that. What's next?
Well, do you want to go into making a Dockerfile? building the stuff. Should we try and speed it up? That's part of it. Build the stuff into the container so we don't have to map as much stuff.
Yeah, so the hypothesis there is changing your composer.json is a very rare activity. So could we use Docker build caching speed up that process? Let's tackle that when we do. So we are going to add a Dockerfile, and then we're going to try and deploy that to Kubernetes. I'm just wondering, is there anything, like from a local dev point of view, is there anything beyond this that is needed? Like in fact, we haven't shown one thing, right? I can change the code and immediately I see something happen, right? So I have no idea where that index page is.
And you left the containers running, didn't you?
I did. Is it action? User action? Is that the default page?
Yeah, maybe we should have used a framework, one of us knows.
Oh. Because I've created that directory with wild permissions, haven't I? Oh, I'm not sure what I've done there. Let's pull up my logs.
Try deleting the folder. That's all you did was touch that file.
Okay, so we're not getting an index now. So we don't actually want an index. What we want is go here.
Maybe try just taking the folder out of the container, the running container, or kill the container and start it again.
That will definitely fix it. I'm just okay. Yeah, we don't need to focus on that. You're right. You're all right. In theory, we can. So that just says hello world. So let's just search for that. So it wasn't actually in any of those things. It was in a root file. Okay. So we should have real-time development experience.
And actually, I think with the project this size, that is an acceptable performance. You know, if you don't want to get too stuck into how Docker works, and you just want to maybe run a really specific version of PHP that you don't have, you don't want to install locally, that's kind of good enough.
Yeah, I'm not going to get frustrated making changes to that and waiting for it to reload. Yeah,
I don't reload that fast when I'm developing. I'll do some work and then go over and check it sometimes if I don't have a test. I've seen devs on big Magento projects waiting 10 seconds for a page to load anyway. Fine.
Okay. So local development, I think we're okay on. The only thing we could potentially modify now would be ability to do, that nginx thing is really bugging me. We're going to make that work.
Okay.
Because we're talking about how we want nginx to deliver static assets, and the minute I did that, I broke it. You not think we should fix that?
Sure. The other thing we could look at is how would we use a database?
Yes.
I'm open to anything. If you want to, what was it that bothered you about the nginx? It was that when you made the folder, it no longer looked at FPM.
Correct. So let's do two things. First, if you're watching and you want us to cover any of the things that we've been talking about, leave a comment and we will make sure that we tackle that, right?
Yeah. What
we'll do for the next few minutes is we will add that database component and we will revert Docker Compose down to version 2, explaining why that's important as we go. Because we do have a migration step that we would want to run. So what's your favorite database?
Favorite or one I use the most?
The one you use the most, I guess.
MySQL.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to use the MariaDB version. But
oh, I don't know. There's the Docker.
It's MySQL, but not owned by Oracle. So.
Yeah.
Had a weird glitch there. Okay, so we're going to run MariaDB. I think the latest version is 10. We will export this to my local machine. I don't know why, but
yeah, you want to run a MySQL client in your IDE or something at some point, won't you?
yep. And then we will shut this down, spin it up, it'll pull the image. Nothing's really changed. It should just kind of work.
So sometimes I'll have two Docker Compose files, right? One that adds a load of exposed ports and extra volumes and things that's explicitly div.
Yes. So, yeah, I forgot about this. We need to tell MariaDB a few environment things. So we have to say MySQL password. That should satisfy that. And we have a question from Glenn. He's just curious, what does the Docker environment variable do? I think Glenn was just a little bit late, so we'll cover that again. This is just a Slim framework thing that tells it to tweak the logging to standard out. So when you do container-based development, you always want the logs here, first and foremost. Even when you go to production, the logs have to go to standard out because that's how they're collected by fluentd, fluentbit, any other log-style thing. And inside of settings, it's just checking for that environment variable that exists. And if it does, it says, okay, we're going to log to standard out. Otherwise, it's going to log to the logs directory. So it's just a Slim framework thing. I'm sure there's a way to configure that for something in Laravel too. We'll do examples of that today or tomorrow. Now we should have MySQL MariaDB/thingy working.
Yep. Can you connect to
and
that?
The challenge is,
have you got a local client you can connect to it from? Or the command line client? You trust your internet connection?
It's pretty solid. I get about 500 meg.
What? It's pretty good.
Sorry, not megs, because we have the SI standards now. Mebibytes. Mebibytes.
Oh, mebibytes. 500 mebibytes.
Megabits. 500 megabits.
It's better than me.
How's that not on green?
It's not symlinked according to the message.
Oh, wait.
It's keg only, which means it's not symlinked into user local because it conflicts. So you have to add it to the path.
Blah, 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 blah.
Oh, camera's going crazy.
So we can do host, local host, port 306, password.
Password.
But it's not a capital H for host down.
I like your security consciousness. You don't have MySQL installed locally, do you?
No, I do not. What's lower H? Let's do 1 to 7.0.0.1. There. User. Finally, there we go.
Nice.
Okay, so that works. Now, the challenge with the 3.7 syntax now is that we have very limited support for depends on. All this accepts and the 3.expect is that. What that tells our Docker engine is that it must start the MariaDB container first.
So that is
it.
And that's so you can do Docker Compose up PHP, and it will also start the other guy, right? Because so far we've just been doing Docker up.
Yeah, so it means when I run Docker Compose up, that I will ensure that the MariaDB container exists, but is not started or healthy. Oh, it exists and started, but not healthy before it starts with PHP 1. Now that's important because the way that Docker Compose handles communication is generally through injecting stuff into the host file. And that name has to exist before that container starts for it to work.
So we could add nginx there as well, right?
Yes. Now, the challenge is when my PHP entry point is checking to the database to see if it has to run a migration, is that MariaDB and most other databases do not start as quickly as FPM. Right? Databases generally take anywhere from 2 or 3 seconds up to maybe a couple of minutes, in worst case, before they can actually start accepting queries or writes to that system. Which means that we lose the wonderful ability of just typing Docker Compose up and it working. We then have to start adding makefiles or bash scripts to do loads of checks, and things get really complicated.
Something that loops until the database arrives and then runs the migrations.
Yeah, what I see people time after time. I used to be a consultant, and every company I would go to had this bash script that tailed the Docker logs, waiting for some random arbitrary string that may or may not change between versions of the database that somehow indicate that it is ready to receive traffic.
So
doing this is
my equivalent is in the PHP. Run the migrations, catch the MySQL connection isn't there yet, and then retry it a few times. So just try and hammer the migrations into the database until you get a success, which is equally.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you could do that too with a restart policy of always, and just keep going and going and going and going. But then the restarts become meaningless, right? We want to restart. To me is important. When a container exits, it means either something needs fixed, something crashed, not that something wasn't available. And those to me are very different failure scenarios that I'd like to understand when I'm building applications.
So in production, you have things like Istio that sort of hold your database connection until the real database is there, and there's very sophisticated solutions around it. But
yeah, so using a service mesh, let's use Istio in production, would allow you to have automatic retries on that connection, which means your application would just be it would just look like a really long request. So then you're still susceptible to timeouts if the application or database takes longer than that to work.
That's a good point.
And it's a really easy way. Like, I mean, that's it. Like, we do that, and then this depends on syntax magically changes into something that is actually useful.
And version 2 is still supported, right? It's still current. There's still
they're just different. I don't think there's been a new 2.x release in a while, but with the open sourcing of the compose, so let's cover a few details here. Docker Compose spec. So this Compose spec website only came out this year, and as Docker saying, right, we're going to give up control of this spec. I said no longer something that we want to own. It's not our IP. We make it available to everyone. So now, I do think that there may be a new 4.x that is catered for dev and production, and there may be changes that make this a different situation. But unfortunately for now, is that Docker did still own it. And what we've got here is 2.4 hasn't been updated since like 2018, not 5.4. And this 3 spec is continuing to evolve, but it has all of that stuff for production in it. So if we take a look at depends on, it's this very simple list where we can specify the service. However, if we change, how do I get to version 2? Then we can still have the list, right? So it works on both. But however, we have this more verbose syntax that actually allows us to say we're not just depending on the service starting, but we actually want to have a condition. We will not start our web application until A, our DB condition is service healthy, and Redis is condition service starting. And that's what we're going to do here. So,
what's the distinction between started and healthy? Started just means it's been the boot started, but it might not be ready, might not be healthy.
Yeah, so if we do nginx condition service started, that's no different than doing that. Right? Those are equivalent.
So that's not going to stop PHP from booting until nginx is finished booting. It's just going to make sure nginx starts up.
Yeah, so that's there primarily to ensure the host name exists, and PHP will be able to resolve that somehow. However, for MariaDB, that's not good enough. What we actually want is service output.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the last time I checked, MariaDB does not ship with any health check instead of its Dockerfile. So we do, excuse me, we do have to provide a health check, and it's as simple as command, and we can then we can then use any command within that container to establish whether we think it's healthy or not. So if we jump into our MySQL container, anything we have available here can be a health check command. Now, I am sure there's probably some MySQL thing we could use.
You could just try and connect, right? Connect to localhost.
We could. I don't want to do it with the MySQL command because it will put me into some sort of shell. So what we can do is, because this is Bash, Bash does some really funky tricks around TCP, where we can actually do echo. Let's just say hi to dev net. I'm going to get this wrong. 3306. I knew I was going to get it wrong.
That's good.
Bash,
I actually had a problem once where the health check was trying to connect internally in the MySQL container, and it was connecting, but it wasn't yet accepting network connections. So it was accepting socket connections locally, but it wasn't accepting connections around through the ports. Ports weren't exposed yet.
So there we go. So this only works with Bash. It doesn't work with other shells, which is okay for MariaDB because we have access to Bash. But you can see that if we try and echo anything to dev TCP localhost and then the port number, Bash will do a check to see if that port is accepting any sort of traffic. When we do 3307, a port that we know doesn't exist, we get this failure, and because it's Bash, we have an exit code which is non-zero, and we can use that as a really rudimentary health check. Now, we're doing that for quickness and kind of speed right now. If we wanted to, we could easily use something more sophisticated. We probably could do a MySQL host 127 root password, and then pass in a query like show databases. To me, that would also be an indicator that it was healthy.
This is what we were doing, but there's a problem with it. It's like it'll still use the local socket rather than the network if it's present. Something crazy like that. So we found it unreliable, basically.
Yeah. If my MariaDB and MySQL knowledge was just a little bit better, I would go with that approach because it gives me a more holistic view of whether it's healthy or not, and not just a port being open. But this doesn't have to be perfect. So
what should happen? MariaDB should ship with a health check, right? That would be the ideal solution.
I would want MariaDB to ship with something that allowed me to do a MySQL test connection like that. I'm not a big fan of health checking system within the Dockerfile themselves. Oh, okay. I do think they should live as part of the Kubernetes manifest or something else, or even in the Docker-compose file for development. Because again, my health checks in dev and production are going to be very different. I don't think they're always going to be ubiquitous. So MySQL just having some sort of check health test command that ensures the database is ready is ideally what I want to see here.
Yep.
Okay. For now, we're going to do echo HTTP localhost 33. I'm going to make this fail to show that this works. But right now, this will never ever get healthy. Make sense?
Mm.
Right. Let's set an interval. Run this every 1 second. So, internal. We're going to spin all this down. Actually, I'm just going to destroy everything. Oh, no, it's not command, it is test. There, okay. So we're going to spin this up. Now, what should happen? I'm going to spin this up in the background, and then we're going to run a Docker PS and try and see if we can understand what's going on. So you can see it starts MariaDB first, then nginx, and our PHP container is not healthy.
I was just looking at the MariaDB documentation, and it says it will not accept incoming connections until the initialization completes. This may cause issues when using tools like docker-compose. Great. So they're not shipping a health check.
But that's good. The fact that they won't accept that connection until the database is healthy means that our rudimentary check on the port will actually be really good. So
yeah, good point.
now you can see that failed to bring up the project. And that's because MariaDB is still unhealthy and it can't start. If we change this and everything back up, it's waiting on MariaDB. Oh, maybe my 1 second is maybe too quick. It's actually not getting healthy in time now. Again.
Oh, so it waits initially for that period before checking.
It will wait 3 of those, I believe.
3.
So if we look at the specs,
Mm.
so we have access to. Oh no, here we go. So we got test, we got interval, and oh yeah, retry.
Okay.
I still can't bring up my project. Does MariaDB take more than 15 seconds?
Do you need to give a parameter to echo?
We shouldn't have to know.
Mm.
So it's still unhealthy, so that is actually failing. Now, I think the reason, so the shell, we can't specify that here. Okay. We can copy this. So that's close. Actually, what we want is test, and we'll do bash -c, and then do echo dev TCP localhost 306. So we're actually saying use bash because we have to have a bash shell for this to work. And run a command, and then that should give us the exit code that we need. Let's try that again. Okay. Bring up. Hey.
So
we can see
did
it's
them
healthy.
separate.
Our nginx is failing. We'll fix that. I don't know why that is.
So if we didn't have the health check, they'd have started in parallel, right?
They would have started in parallel. Instead, we were able to defer the starting of the PHP container until MariaDB was actually healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So nginx failed because that was working. So now, so nginx needs. There we go. There's the reason that we need the service starting. Nginx cannot resolve upstream FPM connection PHP because we got our dependencies a long way around.
Yes. What happens if you put them both? No.
Cyclic dependency would fail. But actually what we're saying is PHP container has to be started, which means the DNS can be resolved before nginx starts. And now we'll get a completely healthy system. Happy with that. All right, so let's ship this to production.
Okay.
So
I type Heroku Go or something.
no, we're going to add a Docker file.
Yeah.
And we're going to leverage the build cache to make sure that we only ever do the composer install once until we change composer.json. We're going to use multi-layers. So there's a really frustrating thing in PHP images. First, if we do 7 alpine fpm, we copy our composer.json, I'm going to set a working there /app, which copies this to /app, and then I say run composer install. This will not work because the PHP images do not ship with composer. I find that just ridiculous. Like, people do not develop PHP without composer anymore, right?
People do.
People don't.
I can give you names.
No, I don't want names. Just agree with me. So
it's also a different organization, right? Composer's a separate group of people.
I do understand that. It's not part of the core PHP group and all that. And also, to be honest, I don't want to compose on my production image. So there is a good thing to it too. But it makes, from a new person developing containers and this kind of workflow, not having that available is probably annoying. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's have a development or a build image.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to copy from the composer image.
You mean copy, right? Not from.
Get. I'm going to do that. Mm-hmm. Then I'm going to do my 7 alpine and no, we want our build image. So from build as we'll call this I'm getting super good.
Call the top one like base.
Base. Good call. From base as build. You knew what I was trying to do. At least why you're here.
And do you want the copy to be after build in the build?
So this base image is just something that I can use as a base with the tools that I need. So I'm just adding composer to PHP. Then in the build, I'm going to copy and composer.json and do the installation.
Okay. Can you?
I just put these up. It's kind of visual.
How tight would you be about the versions of everything? I know in real life, would you be specifying a point release of PHP?
Yeah, I probably would. I would. So I would do that.
Point.
And what I like about this approach is I can now use this here. So I've only got this defined once. There could very easily be a version appearance here, and that I wouldn't know what I'm doing. So I could say build Dockerfile. Well, we don't need to specify Dockerfile because it's in the default location. We need a context, and because this is multi-layer, we need a target, and I can say use the base image to run this in dev. If I really want to add extra stuff to the dev version, I could then extend base here, the dev, and I could add my dev tooling. So it's really common to say, let's have APK add, update, and say I need
Xdebug.
Xdebug. I don't think that's I don't think it's in the Alpine repository, but yeah, that would work. So.
And often in different environment variables and things. I know you do that in the composer. So I would put the composer copy inside just the build image because I don't want that in my base.
If I'm going to use base for development, I will.
I don't want composer in my dev container necessarily. You're going to be running composer in your image? In your container?
For local development, yes.
You're going to that's not the way I do it, but you're going to be doing exec composer install on the running dev container.
Okay, so this is where the way I work is a bit different to most people. So some people will run composer install on their local machine. I'm very much against that because what happens there is you have to do no prereq checks. And there's a flag that you can pass it to say, don't check for prerequisites on the host, like PHP extensions being a really good example. What I generally do is provide a makefile with a target called D shell, and that puts me inside of the container, and I work locally that way.
Right. Because it's quite rare, like you said, it's quite rare to edit compose.json at a certain point in the project. You're not really editing it very often. I would rebuild when I edited it. I just sort of remember to rebuild, or do a makefile that rebuilds it.
Okay. I think let's finish off this Dockerfile, and then we'll show how that step works then. So,
do you want to build it now? Check it works.
Yeah. So we just have a couple of comments based on that conversation there. So we've got one saying someone Marg who says, yes, I would run Composer in the container. You may have multiple projects with multiple Composer versions. Yeah. I mean, I would definitely run that container too. And we get parity in CI. I think that's so important. Like me running make build locally should be the same as my CI. There should be no distinction between those two.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got from build as prod. And no, we want to do our production image is going to be
from base.
We didn't finish the build. Copy everything to app.
That's the
and
current
then
one.
Have
Yeah.
So we want our base. Dev is going to have a composer. We're going to use a dev image as our base for building. And then we use our base image for production. And what we do here is we say copy all of our build artifacts from build /app.
Okay.
We can
that
work out here, so it only happens once.
So we no longer have the Composer installer on prod, which is where I thought we were going.
We're taking the Composer install out of our production image. And as far as command goes, I can't remember the FPM syntax.
Why are you specifying it? Why are you overriding the base images? Is that a best practicey thing?
Okay, you're right. I can just stick that here. That's what I expect by default.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so what does this mean?
On the on line 13, you want one of them to say, do you want to copy Composer lock as well?
No, I don't commit my lock files. I would consider that a faux pas. Because people can, the only reason you should commit your log file is if you need idempotent builds. If I'm shipping as a Docker container, I don't need that. I have the cache, I have the container, I can reuse that cache. So if I need to have a specific build where I change something, I can then reference that. Committing a log file means that I'm not going to get automatic security updates. It just removes a lot of things that make me slightly uncomfortable.
So it's because you're going to be running your CI and smoke tests after the image is built anyway. You don't need the guarantee that the image is being built with a specific set of dependencies. I think committing the lock file comes from that workflow where you're running CI just in PHP, and you want that lock file to reflect the set of dependencies that are going to be deployed. You get that for free with Docker, right?
Yeah, I have an immutable image that cannot change. So I wouldn't commit my log file. I don't commit my log file for any code, any language.
I would commit. So the rule is I would commit my lock file if I'm going to be testing based on the lock file and then separately deploying based on the same lock file. So then the lock file is giving me that sync that the thing I tested is the thing I'm deploying. With Docker, you're not doing that separation. You're testing one thing and then you're moving it into prod. So you don't need that extra synchronization point.
Yep, good point.
Thank you.
Let me regain my train of thought. Okay, so we want to build this now, and we want to show how we're leveraging the build cache so that we don't. Composer install wasn't particularly slow in this project, but it can take many minutes. right? So we don't want to do that unless that file changes, which is why we're being very specific about the order that we copy all of this in. So if I do a build and I target build, and I'll call it Rawkode build, so I don't clash with the PHP images that I have. I pass in the build context, so I'm saying tag, not target. Target tag. So I'm targeting my build layer, I'm tagging it Rawkode build, and I'm hitting go. That's 7.4. Okay, we'll just take out the point version just now. I don't want to have to look that up. And that should be base anyway. Okay. So we run this. Did I get that wrong? PHP 7-fpm Alpine.
Yeah, maybe.
There we go. Now, this hopefully not take too long. It is running a composer install because this is the first time we have run this step.
Is this using build kit?
This is using build kit. That's why
So
it looks a bit different.
Potentially they'll build in parallel.
If I had multiple layers where steps could be run in parallel, yes, they would run in parallel. So, you know, we could show that working. We could add another layer that ran our unit tests, and those would run in parallel with, say, something that was doing a compilation of our JavaScript asset, because those wouldn't conflict.
That was what I was thinking. This composer step, build step could be running, and the npm build step be running, and then dev depend on both of them.
Exactly. Now, if we run this again, it takes no time at all. Nothing has changed. Nothing has to happen. Now, if we change the target to production, the only thing that should run is this. We've got cached, 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 cached. The production step runs. Now,
why don't you make an edit to index PHP?
Great idea.
In public. Yeah.
So I say $1 million change. And we want to rebuild our production image. And what the important thing that I believe you're trying to have me demonstrate here is, if we pull up our Dockerfile, is that the way the cache of validation works in Docker is it starts at the top of this file and it says, has anything in this layer changed that would cause a rebuild? No. Has anything in this line changed that would cause a rebuild? No. Then. Has composer.json changed? No, which means we don't have to run composer install. This copy has changes. We've just modified the index.php with our comment. So our cache is invalidated here, which means everything below this in the file has to be run again. And we've changed that file, which means when I run this, the composer.json and the composer install do not need to run. So, perfect. You can see our composer install and our cached composer.json did not run. It was very fast. It just changed our code, produced the image, and that was it. Now, if we change the composer.json, the composer install would run again, and then every step below that would run. I don't think we need to cover that. I think hopefully we've explained that well enough that people understand the build cache and why that's really important for building these images. I mean, that was ridiculously fast. That's what I want.
And that's a good reason to have separate build targets for the PHP composer install and the npm, is that you'll only be invalidating one of them if something changes. So having a kind of diamond shape to your targets, where two extend this one and then something depends on both of them, can really help with builds, because the caching, like you say, is sequential in terms of layers. So splitting things out and then copying the finished assets into the final image can be really helpful.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I guess it's also worth pointing out that this is not unique to Composer or PHP. Any language with a package manager will have a file like composer.json. For Rust, it would be the cargo.toml. For npm, node-based stuff is package.json. This exact pattern works for all of those languages, frameworks, and runtime.
And is it based on the hash of the files? Something
It
like
is,
that?
yes. Yeah. So it's the collective hash of the file system. So because the only thing changing at this layer is that one file, it only has to check the hash of that one file. Where it's a whole directory like that, it would be a cache of everything together as a sum.
Yeah. And so it's important to also include things in Docker ignore, because here where we're copying everything into the image, it's important anything that's going to be a transient file or change over time should be Docker ignored, right?
Very true.
Which maybe it is, but
yeah, so there are a lot of things here that we would not expect to trigger a rebuild, and the best way to handle that.
Yeah. So if you're refreshing the cache locally, you don't want that invalidating your builds.
Yeah, or even just a README. Like, do I want a README to cause a rebuild of this application?
Yeah, and it also stops it being in the image as well, right?
It does. It will. So the way this works is it won't. If we look at this command, on the end we have this dot. That's called the build context. And like Docker, as sophisticated as it is, this is not sophisticated. That dot means that the Docker engine will actually target that entire context, that directory, and send that to the engine. And that context is what ends up in your image if you copy the things in. So this one, if we have a .docker ignore, those files are stripped at the context stage and never actually touch the Docker engine ever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. So it all gets zipped up or something, right? And then transferred or tarred up.
Yep. Yeah, there's. I mean, we work mostly on local machines where the Docker engine and the context are available locally, but that's not always the case. And in fact, Docker expects that Docker engine to be remote. In fact, Docker for Mac is that the engine is actually in a VM. So it's all tarred up together and sent over the pipe into the VM, where it is then analyzed, extracted, and so forth. Okay, we've not got any more questions, so how are you for time?
I need to go in about 10 minutes, but I mean, you could continue without me.
No, let's finish up in 10 minutes. So if you are watching and you've got any questions on anything we've covered or anything that we've not covered that you want to know or want us to explain, now is your chance. This is it. You get 10 minutes. So that gives me 10 minutes to then ship this image to Kubernetes.
Perfect. So would you do a similar build step for the nginx just to get the config file in there, or would you leave that till later?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't use a proprietary image for nginx and Kubernetes. I would use the official upstream ones, but provide a volume mount of the config through a config map.
So if it's just a bit of config, you'd always use a volume for that.
Yeah, I wouldn't build an image for that. I just don't think there would be any value add on doing so. Because remember, I've then got to store those images in my own registry somewhere, which means I then have to handle regular maintenance. I have to rebuild it regularly so that I'm getting security updates and patches. I have to do security analysis of it. All that stuff that I really don't want to have to worry about when all I'm doing is modifying one piece of configuration.
Yeah.
Okay, so I use my op directory for stuff like this. I'm going to create a Kubernetes. And I'm going to have our php-fpm deployment YAML. And I have a nice extension which just kind of templates it all for me. Oh no. Oh, let's see. Oh, editorconfig. Come back to big then, yeah. Yeah. Okay, right. The image which I built was called Rawkode build. I'm not going to change that, so we'll just do this. I'm not going to use any resource constraints for the time being. I am going to keep this line here because if I remove it, I get loads of squiggles. And it's just telling me, hey, you probably don't want to deploy this into Kubernetes without having resource controls.
Right.
And we're going to say that our FPM runs on port 9000. And that's it. It's good, right? Next, we need our PHP nginx deployment.
So you'd be building that image as part of your CI pipeline.
The
Right.
php-fpm Apple and the FPM.
Yeah. So you wouldn't. So is that the best practice? Is you don't build those things as part of your Kubernetes deployment process. You develop things locally. Something like CI then pushes an official image somewhere after tests have passed, and you're deploying off of that.
Yeah, I'd have something that then runs inside of my Kubernetes cluster that would detect them as a new image and do an automatic rollout or deployment on it.
Right, so it's not pushing out to Kubernetes, it's pushing to a registry and then Kubernetes.
Yes, I would never have my CI pushed to a Kubernetes cluster because then my CI has to know the cluster exists.
Yeah.
And it makes it really difficult to do ephemeral clusters. So if I want to spin up like a pre-prod or a temporary environment to do some testing,
Gotcha.
I have to build that into the CI step, and I always try to keep those separate. So instead, what I'll have is we push the image with a certain tagging format that might say this is good for production deployment, and then have many environments that can pull that through. And anything with a test environment would have a slightly different tagging format.
Right.
Okay, so we're going to call this nginx. We use default nginx image. And we go this. And this is available on port 80. Excuse me. Okay, now we need a config map. For quickness, I'm just going to copy this from here. Normally I wouldn't do that. And I would have custom. So there's a tool called Customize. It's built in to kubectl. And it can actually just create the config map for you from a local file. So that means I don't have a duplication. If you want to read about that, it's on customize.io. You would go to docs and there's something there. You can tell it to pull in a file as a config map.
Okay.
It's definitely there, I promise. So I think I had to come in one more. And we call this the default.conf because that's what the file's called. Now this changes. So we can either have a service called PHP or I could use something else. Oh, in fact, I've got these as two deployments, which I also wouldn't do. I guess it doesn't matter for now. We could run nginx as a sidecar container in our FPM. What do you want to see? What's more important for you?
Can you define sidecar container?
So in a pod in Kubernetes, a sidecar container is generally what we would call any container beyond the main container that provides new functionality. So we could have a deployment that runs FPM, and then we could deploy a sidecar container, so an nginx container next to it, where they share the same namespaces, which means that they can communicate over localhost. So let's do that because, yeah, let's just do that. I think that makes more sense. It's how I would do it in production. There's no point in me changing from what I would normally do. So
do whatever's fast.
So we just add a new container. We say we're going to augment our PHP application with nginx as a port. And then in my configuration map here, I'm actually just going to use localhost on port 9000. They share the same networking namespace. So it means I don't even have a network hop to go to get to it either. So performance, cool. The only thing I need to do now is map this config map. Now this is where I'm going to forget the syntax, but let's see what happens. We define a volume called nginx config, which is a config map ref, with the name of, I think I called it nginx. Yep.
Yeah.
So now makes this available to me and it can be consumed here. That's volume mounts, and we're going to mount this to nginx const.d, and we're going to mount our nginx config. Now, I only want to mount a single file.
Default, yeah.
I do that. Okay. I think this might work. It might work. So what I'm going to do is that we're going to shut down all the Docker-compose stuff. My Docker for Mac is already running Kubernetes.
Which is a tick box in there, isn't it? You just turn it on and it works.
Yeah. So you can see it's running and it's just under preferences. Not the fastest application. Yeah, tick box. So I can now do a kube control apply -f opt Kubernetes. And let's do the config map first. Running. So you can see we have 2 containers. It's running, hopefully still running. And all I'm going to do is port forward to this pod. Closing that in port 8080. So before I do that, this will be broken. And then
Hey.
we now have our 2 container pod with nginx speaking to FPM over localhost, and look at the response time. Drastically better than a PHP built-in web server. And even better than the 2 container setup locally as well. Drastically better.
Because of the lack of volume mapping, right? So all the files are inside the baked container that you built.
Yeah, this is our now production image. There's no network traffic between nginx and FPM, which makes it a little bit faster. Even with the 2 containers locally, they'd still be going over a TCP connection. So there would still be a little bit of latency added there.
Right.
But this is really fast.
Awesome.
We had.
I have to leave at this point. It's been really good, David. Thanks for. I've learned a lot of things, so thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll do another 5 minutes and I'll finish up. And I'll speak to you.
I'll watch the end when I get back.
Right, see you later. So we just had a question that I'll tackle there quickly. Is does this mean I cannot scale nginx and FPM independently? So that is correct. When you're using multiple containers in a pod, yeah, you scale them together. If, for your own reasons, you don't want to take that approach, you would deploy them separately. And that would just mean, taking that out, creating our FPM nginx deployment instead. We'd call nginx. We'd update the image. In fact, I can just. But it does mean that my config map has to change because we are going over the Kubernetes TCP stack now. So instead, I'd be looking for something that resolves to PHP, which just means I have to expose a service for FPM. So I want to call it PHP, and if we look at the selector, I can say that we have a label called app php-fpm. So I can say app php-fpm, and the service is going to map port 9000. And now our nginx, we can scale that independently. So we can do a delete deployment php-fpm. I'm going to reapply all of our manifests. We've got something invalid in nginx. Oh, yeah, the volume mount I didn't copy across. We reapply all of those manifests. And what we have now is that our PHP FPM is already running, nginx is behind it. Those can be scaled independently now. In fact, I could come into our FPM, modify the spec replicas. I'll say 2, and in fact, let's say 5. I don't know if these are log scheduled based on my laptop's constraints, but we may need 2 nginx and 5 FPM. We run apply again. And there we go. We've got 5 FPMs, 2 nginx. Now, what's different from the last setup is that we now have a service of PHP. We can describe that service. And we can see all the endpoints from all of those pods. Now, if I port forward nginx, let's grab the first one. Then it still works. In fact, then going over the TCP stack hasn't really modified the time too much. Still really fast. And that's it. So now you can choose whatever fits your model. Because, I mean, the overhead of running nginx is relatively small. Running it as a sidecar at FPM, I generally think it's okay. I'm not throwing away too much resources that aren't going to be consumed. But if you do really want to deploy and scale them separately, then that would be how you do it. All right, I'm going to delete those resources. They're all going away. Next steps. So I am going to push this repository up. If you've forgotten where that was, or you've just joined, it is on gitlab.com/rawkode/php examples. The codes from today will exist in Kubernetes and Docker. I do plan to do another session, either next week or the following week, where we talk about using Kubernetes for local development as well. So just removing Docker completely. And because it was kind of a couple of questions early on, I will also push a Laravel version of this some point today or tomorrow morning. The only difference is going to be between Laravel and the Slim framework stuff that we did today is just that it will have a little bit of extra automation around handling that build step of the Node.js stuff. And the only thing that changes is just the Dockerfile has another layer that does the asset compilation. And that's it. There's not really a lot extra to add there. But I want to make sure that I provide everything that's required. So let's do that. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope that was useful, and feel free to leave more comments. You can grab me on Twitter if you want to ask any questions afterwards. I'm always happy to help people out. Feel free to get in touch, and thank you for joining me. It's been good fun. Have a nice day.